Seeding your database with TypeORM in NestJs is a little tricky, but in this video I will show you how you can seed your database with TypeORM in your NestJs project. So welcome back to our NestJs full course where you can learn NestJs from zero to hero. This is Sakaradev channel, and without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so what is this seeding process? Here, as you can see, we have these tables in our database and all of them are empty. With seeding process, we are going to create some testing data or fake data in order to test our application. So seeding would be something like this. We just run a command npm run seed in our NestJs application. Okay, and then if I go back to our database and just refresh the tables, you can see now we have some testing data in the tables of our database. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can seed your database in this way with running just one command in your console. Okay, so now let's get into it. Okay, in the first step, we need to install the dependencies. So I open up the terminal and I'm going to say npm I and then TypeORM extension and also add faker-js/faker. So let's install these two dependencies. Okay, now in the next step, we need to create a factory for each of our entities in our application. So what are these factories? A factory is responsible for creating an instance of an entity. For example, user factory is responsible for creating an instance of the user entity and then initialize its properties with some values and then return that instance of the user entity. Then we are going to create a seeder file in which we are going to use the factory for each entity and then create some testing instances of our entities and then just insert them to our database. So now let's create the factories for our entities. Inside the src directory, we're going to create a directory. I'm going to call it seeding. And then inside it, first we are going to create a factory for user entity. So it is going to be user.factory.ts. Inside this factory, we need to export an object, export const, and name it user factory. And then we need to set it to set seeder factory from TypeORM extension. Okay, it takes two parameters. The first one is the type of the entity, which is going to be user in this case. Okay, so let's import the user from the user entity file. And then in the second, we need to pass a callback, and inside that callback, we need to create an instance of the user entity and then just return it. So let's pass the callback here, and this callback takes an instance of the faker class. So I just call it faker, and we need to set its type to the faker class that comes from the add faker-js/faker. And in case you haven't used the faker class so far, it is for creating some fake values. So you're going to see how it works in a second. So now let's go to the body of this callback. And as I said here, we need to create an instance of the user entity and then just initialize its values with the faker class and then just return it. So in the first line, we need to create an instance of the user entity. So const user and set it to new instance of the user class. Then we need to initialize its properties. So let's first initialize the user.firstname, and for its value we need to use the faker class. So I just use faker, which we have it from the parameter of this callback, and then person, and then just call the first name function. So it actually creates a random first name of a person, and then we're going to just set it to the user.first name. That's it. So we're going to do the same for the last name, and just here call the faker.person.last name. We're going to do the same for the email, user.email, and set it to faker.internet.email. Okay, it offers a lot of function for creating fake values in many fields. Okay, next we're going to set the user.avatar URL and set it to faker.image.avatar. Okay, and then we just need to return the user, and that's it for the user factory. Next, we just need to create a factory for all of these entities. So I just copied these codes and just create a new file for property factory. So just call it property.factory.ts. just paste the previous code here. Let's just rename the user factory to property factory. Here we need to pass the property entity in the first parameter of the set seeder factory. And as I just changed the entity here, we have an error here, and that's because now this callback needs to return an instance of the property entity. So here we just remove these codes, okay, and then create a new instance of the property entity. So just call it property equals to new property class, and then here just return the property. Now we need to initialize the properties of this real estate property with the faker class. So property.name is going to be faker.location, and here we just call the street. It will return a random street name. Then let's initialize the property.price. I'm going to use faker, then call the commerce module.price. Then here pass a configuration object, specify mean and set it to 10,000 and max to 10 million. This price function returns a string, so we need to just turn it to a number by putting a plus before it. Then we're going to initialize the property.description and set it to faker.lorem.sentence. So it will create a random sentence of some gibberish words. And here we just return the property. So that's it for the property factory. Now let's create a factory for property feature. Just call it property feature.factory.ts and just paste the user factory code, and here let's rename it to property feature factory. And for the first parameter of set seeder factory, we need to pass the property feature entity, and here let's remove these lines. We need to create an instance of the property feature class, so I'll just call it feature, set it to new property feature, and we just need to return it from this callback. Okay, now let's initialize the properties of the property feature instance. So feature.area, I'm going to set it to faker.number.int, and then pass in configuration object, set the mean to 25 and max to, for example, 2500. Okay, just copy this line and here initialize the feature.bathrooms and just set the mean to 1 and max to, for example, 3. We'll do the same for the feature.bedrooms. Okay, initialize the parking spot in the same way, and then initialize the feature.hasBalcony, and here we just need to call the faker.datatype boolean. Okay, do the same for the as garden yard and also as swimming pool. Okay, let's save this, and here as you can see in the last line we just return this feature. Okay, so that's it for creating the factories, and as you can see here we have a property type entity, and here as you can see we just need to set the value of the property type, and since we just want to create two types, for example just condo and apartment types, we are going to hard code these two types in our seeder file, because as I said we just want two of these property types, so we don't need to create a factory. As I said in the beginning of this video, inside the factories we are going to create an instance and then initialize them with the faker object. So here, since we just want two predefined type, we don't need to create a factory for the property type. So now in the next step, we need to create our main seeder in which we are going to use these factories and then create some instances and then just insert them into our database. So now let's create it. I'm going to call it main.seeder.ts. Here we need to export a class. I'm going to call it main seeder, which implements the seeder class that comes from the TypeORM extension. Inside this main seeder class, we need to implement the run function. So here I'm going to create a public async run function. As you can see, it creates the parameters for this run function. It takes a data source, which is actually a TypeORM data source. and the second one is factory manager. With the data source, we can access to the repositories of our entities, and with factory manager, we can access to our factories that we have created here. And then inside the body of this run function, we are going to use the factories for creating some testing instances of our entities, and then we just insert them into our database. So now, in the first place, let's insert two property type into our database. So as I said, since we have just two predefined property type, we don't need to use property type factory. We just directly use the repository of the property type and then insert our two property type into our database. So in the first step, we need to access to the repository of the property type. It is different from accessing to the entities repositories. Here is different from the way we access them in the NestJs modules. In our NestJs module, we just inject them using the dependency injection manager of the NestJs, but these seeding files are separated from our NestJs modules. We are going to run them separately outside of our NestJs application, so we can't use the dependency injection here. We need to access the entities repos through these data source that we have here in the parameter. So for example, accessing to the property type repo is just like this. We're going to say const property type repo. I just call it type repo and set it to data source that get repository function, and just we need to pass the entity class, which in this case is property type class. With this type repo, we can insert our two property type into our database. So here I'm going to say const property types and set it to await type repo, and then save. Then inside it, we're going to pass a list of two objects. In the first one, we're going to set the value of our first property type. I'm going to set it to condo, and then pass another property type and just set its value to, for example, apartment. Okay, it will insert these two instances into the property types table and then return them to the property types list. So it contains these two inserted property types. Okay, and before that, we can just console like something like seeding property types. Okay, and then here, let's say we are going to insert 10 users into our database. So after inserting the property types, we are going to use user factory for inserting 10 users into our database. So first we need to access to the user factory. In order to do that, we use factory manager to access to the user factory. So here I'm going to say const user factory and set it to factory manager that gets function, and we need to pass the user entity class. It will return the user factory. And here, if I go to the user factory file, you can see we use set seeder factory and specify the type of the entity. So now the factory manager knows that this is going to be the factory of the user entity. So let's get back to our main seeder file, and here we're going to use this user factory to insert our 10 users. So I'm going to say const users and then set it to await user factory dot save many function. Then we just need to specify the number of users that we want to insert. In this case, I just passed 10. It will create the fake users with the user factory class and then just insert them into the user table with the user repository. That's it. So here, let's just copy this console log and say seeding users. Okay, and then we need to seed the property entity. But if I go to the property entity, it is a complex entity. Other than these simple types member, it has a property feature member, which its type is property feature. It is also a entity. It has a user property and also a type property, which its type is property type. So it's a complex entity. And in order to seed this entity, first we need to create some instances of the property entity and then just initialize its user property feature and also its property type. So first we need to create some instances of our property entity, and for each instance we are going to initialize the user property feature and its type, and then we are going to insert them into our database. So here I'm going to say const properties, which is going to be a list of the properties that we are going to create. and we're going to set it to promise.all, and then inside it we need to pass a list of promises that each of these promises is responsible for creating a property instance. So we need to create an array and then map through that array, and for each member of this array we are going to return a promise that will create a property. So here we are going to use the array class. Okay, for example, let's say we are going to create 50 property entity instances, so we just pass 50, and then it doesn't matter what is the values of this array, so just fill it with an empty character. Okay, and now we can map through this array. Here inside the map function we are going to return a promise that will actually return a property. And also, instead of this approach, we can use a for loop that iterates 50 times, and in each iteration we can just create one property. But the advantage of using the promise.all, just like this here, is that we can create these properties simultaneously. So we're going to use this approach, and inside the map function we are going to pass a async callback that finally returns a property instance. So we're going to use an async callback. It doesn't use the value of the array. So inside it, first we are going to create a property. I'm going to say const property and set it to await. And then we need to access to the property factory. So here we're going to access to the property factory. So I'm going to say const property factory, and we're going to access it using the factory manager.get, pass the property entity to it. Okay, now we can use the property factory, and then here, instead of just saving the property, we are going to call the make function. It is actually create an instance, but it doesn't save it in our database. So here, if I go to the property factory, you can see that we only initialize its simple properties like name, price, and description. We don't initialize the property feature, property type, and also the user. So here, in order to initialize the user property feature and its property type, we're going to pass a configuration object, and inside this object we can additionally initialize some of its members like user. So we're going to set the user to one of the users that we have saved in this line, and as you can see, the users list now contains these 10 inserted users into our database. So we are going to choose one of these 10 users and set it to user of the property. So in order to randomly choose one, again we're going to use the faker.helpers and then array element, and here we need to pass an array. So it is going to be users list. Actually choose one of the users from this list and then pass it to this user member here. In the same way, we are going to set the property type of the property entity. So we're going to use the faker.helpers.array element again and just pass the property types list here that contains these two saved property types. So we just pass the property types here. Okay, now we just need to initialize the property feature. So here we're going to specify the property feature, and this time we are going to use the property feature factory to create a property feature for us. So first we need to access to the property feature factory. Here, copy this line of code. We're going to set it to property feature factory, and then here we need to pass the property feature. Okay, so with the factory manager we have access to the property feature factory. Now we're going to call the property feature factory dot save function. It will create an instance of property feature based on these values that we have set to the property feature, and then save it into our database and then return it to the property feature member here. Okay, so in this way we are creating a complex property entity with its user, property type, and property feature. So again, here let me remind you that this make function doesn't save the property into our database. It just creates an instance of this property with these extra values. So now after the make function we need to return the property. Okay, as you can see, it is on the map function, so it finally returns the list of 50 properties to this properties list here. Now we just need to use the property repo to save these 50 properties. So after the promise.all function, we're going to access to the property repo. So first we're going to get it from the data source const property repo and set it to data source that get repository function and just pass the property entity class to it. Okay, now we can save the properties. So here, just use await and use the property repo, call the save function, and then pass the properties list that we've got here. So just pass it here to the save function, and it will insert these properties into our database. So that's it for our main seeder function. And before moving forward, let's just log the message here and log into the console seeding properties. Okay, and now we need to create a seed file, which is actually the entry point of our seeding process. So here we're going to create a seed.ts file. And here first we need to create a data source. So for creating a data source, we need to create a data source option. It is actually just like the dbconfig that we have here. And actually it is using for setting up a connection to our database. So let's get back to the seed file. And here first we need to create the options for our data source. So here I'm going to say const options and set its type to data source options. As you can see, it is coming from the TypeORM. So here, as I said, data source options contains these data, but here we need to specify the factories and our main seeder file. So here we just extend these type and add the seeder options that comes from the TypeORM extensions. Now we can initialize these options. First, we need to just spread the pgconfig object from our dbconfig, okay? And then in addition to the pgconfig, we need to set the factories to a list that contains all of these factories. So the first one is going to be property factory. The second one is going to be user factory. And the next is going to be property feature factory. And then we need to specify the seeds list. So we are going to pass our seeders. We just have one seeders and it is main seeder. So we just pass the main seeders that comes from the main.seeder file. Okay, now with this data, we can create a data source. So here I want to say const data source and set it to new TypeORM data source. So just set the data source of the TypeORM and we need to pass the options. Okay, now we need to initialize the data source. So just call the data source that initialize and then call the then function because this is a async function. And after initializing, we're going to pass a callback to the then function, which actually runs after the initialize function is done. So we're going to pass an async here, and inside it, first we are going to call the synchronize of the data source. So I'm going to call the await data source dot synchronize and set it to true. Actually, just synchronize the database schema based on the entities that we have in our application. Okay, after that, we just call the run seeders function. So run seeders function comes from the TypeORM extension. So wait run seeders, as you can see, it comes from the TypeORM extension, and then we just need to pass the data source. And since inside the data source we have specified the options, and in the options we have specified the seeds file, it will actually runs the main seeder file. So after running the seeders, we just need to use the process.exit to end running this file. So that's it for our seeding process. Now we are going to add a script in the package.json file and call this seed.ts file. So here in the script section of the package.json, we're going to add another script. We just call it seed, and we just need to run the seed.ts file with the ts node because this is a TypeScript file, and then specify the path of our seed file, which is on the src and then seeding directory, and call the seed.ts. Okay, let's save this, and now we can run this script with the npm run seed. So I open up the terminal, let's clear this up, and I'm going to use npm run seed. Okay, we have an error here, and it actually can't find the dbconfig file. So I go to the seed.ts. Here we need to specify the path of our imports. So as I said, since this is not a NestJs module, here we need to specify the path of these imports relatively to this seed.ts file. So the seed is on the seeding, and we need to go up one level, and then we are in the src, and we need to go up one level again, and then we can access to the db config file. We need to do the same for all of these imports. Also, we need to go to the main seeder file and update these import path in the same way. So here the entities directory is one level up from the seeding directory, so we just need to go one level up, and let's replace it with the src in all of these imports. Okay, let's save this. We need to go to the property factory, also update the import path here, and also here in the property feature factory, and also on the user factory. So let's save this. Now let's open up our terminal again. Let's clear this out first, and let's run our seed script. So again, we have an error and it can't find the property feature entity. So just go to the property feature, and I forgot to save this file. Again, let's run the seed, and as you can see now, this seeding process is running, seeding the property types, seeding the users, and also seeding the properties, and it's done without any error. So now let's go to the Neon console where we host our Postgres database. Okay, let's go to our project. Let's go to the tables. You can see now we have 50 property feature for each property, and we have 50 property in our database. We have 2 property type, and also we have our 10 users. Okay, so we have successfully seeded our Postgres database with TypeORM. And yeah, that's it for this video. And now that we have some testing data in our database, we can try complex CRUD operations with this database. So in the next video, we are going to do some complex CRUD operations. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell in order to get informed about the next video. And also, if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button, because it really gives me energy to move forward through this course and create more episodes of this NestJs full course for you. So stay tuned for my next video. Have a nice time, and bye bye.